Hello, cruel, cruel world. So Chaz Maximen was only 17 when he knocked on the door of Dr. Adam Towler, which is in Clifton in Bristol, on the 30th of October 2019. He apparently selected this address at random, pulled the doctor into the road and repeatedly knifed him, inflicting deep wounds to his chest and one that punctured his lungs and narrowly punctured his heart. These guys were complete strangers, so this was completely random, completely senseless. So why am I talking about this? Well, Chanz was recently sentenced to prison and he was assessed by psychiatrists and they couldn't find any diagnosis of mental illness. They couldn't find any particular reason. So here are my questions. Why was he not diagnosed with any mental illness? What is the kind of explanation for these senseless attacks? What's my personal opinion as a consultant forensic psychiatrist on the possible diagnosis? And also, what difference does it make? Why does it matter whether he's got a psych diagnosis or not? So I will answer all these questions and many, many more in this episode of A Psych for Sore Minds. So as I said before, my name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Okay, let me first expand on the background of the case. Let me tell you a bit more. Let's take it back to the concrete streets. So this guy, Chaz Maximen, he was 17 at the time, he's 19 now. As I said, he knocked on this guy's door, who was a doctor, complete random stranger in Bristol, October the 30th, 2019, selected this address at random. Here's an interesting bit. He apparently said to the doctor, "You killed the girl." So that was a phrase that didn't make sense at the time. It's never really been explained since that time. I think it's potentially relevant in terms of the diagnosis, but we will come back to that. So what actually happened is that Maximen left the doctor on the doorstep or on the street outside of his house bleeding, left for dead. But then later on he returned to the property, by which time the victim had managed to crawl his way back inside and shut the door and lock the door. And Maximen was literally trying to get back in and trying to break the door, but luckily he didn't. This gets even more kind of senseless and bizarre and random and frankly frightening because the victim, Dr. Towler, was 54 and he was the first of 3 people who Maximen randomly attacked in the Clifton area at night over the space of about 3 weeks. So he was on the run from the police for about 3 weeks before they caught him. In terms of his other victims, one was a warehouse worker who stopped at a bench to take a little break on his way back home from a night shift, and Maximen ran up to him, sliced him with a knife. And another was a female student. All 3 of his victims were alone when Maximen approached them. During his trial, there were multiple assessments by psychiatrists, and as I said before, they didn't find anything wrong with him. So why am I talking about this now? Because he was in the news very recently. So only a few days before I recorded this, about a week before you see it, in Bristol Crown Court on Wednesday in the middle of February, and he was sentenced to a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 12 years. So that means that potentially he could be released after 12 years if he can convince a parole board that he is safe. Now, what kind of blows my mind about this case is that he was a normal teenager to all extents and purposes. He'd been studying for his A-levels at the time and he had no history of violence. So he's not like a thug. I've seen him being called a thug in a couple of newspaper articles. I'm not diminishing what he did was absolutely horrific and inexplicably violent, but outside of these actions, he wasn't like a violent person. So outside of this 3-week period, which I think is relevant to his potential psychiatric diagnosis, he was not a thug, had no history of violence. He had been diagnosed with a learning disability, and I'll come back to that later, but he attended mainstream school and he did not need the service of an intermediary during his trial. Again, I'll come back onto that because that's all relevant. So when he was examined, he was not found to be suffering from any acute mental illness, and he was deemed fit to plead by the court, so he's well enough to go through his trial. So now he's been sentenced. In this moment in time, he is in HMP Belmarsh, which I'm sure you've heard about. He's a category A prisoner, so he's deemed as one of the most dangerous prisoners, and he's on a 3-man unlock. So that means he's deemed so dangerous that he's not allowed out of his cell or to move around the prison unless he's accompanied by 3 prison guards. So despite the ferocity of the attack and despite the severity of the injuries that the victim, Dr. Towler, said, he's actually said to the press that he's concerned for Maximen, the perpetrator. He read in a victim impact statement, which was read out in court, he said, and I quote, I'm just reading from my computer, "I'm not upset or angry with you. I don't think you owe me an apology or anything, but I do want you to know what it's like for me. I say again that I'm not angry with you, but I want to say that I'm a real human being, just as you are, and I respect our lives equally." And then referring to Maximen's other victim, Dr. Towler said, "We're all real human people who live, love and hate, but killing should not be a human thing." And that nearly happened. So why am I doing this video on this case? I'm going to get to my psychoanalysis shortly, but I first want to answer that question. Firstly, because somebody reached out in the comments section and asked my opinion. So sorry, I can't remember who you are, but props to you and thank you for the idea. And also because it made me interested, because I question whether the psychiatrist got the right diagnoses. So I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders and I give evidence as an expert witness in criminal cases. I wasn't involved in this case, but I've certainly been involved in many similar cases, and I've assessed defendants to see what their mental state was like at the time of their offence, to see if they're criminally culpable or not. So that's why I wanted to give you this psychoanalysis, my personal psychoanalysis, which I'm about to get onto. Before I do that, I just really want to quickly mention that I've got a Discord channel page. I've got to be honest with you, I'm not even entirely sure what that is, but somebody's helped set me up, so there'll be a link for it, hopefully in this video. If not, then check it out. However, search for it on the internet, etc., and we can chill together, bond on Discord. I don't know how it works, but I will figure it out, I promise. Okay, let's get to the important bit. Let's get to my psychoanalysis. This is the money shot of the video, if you will. What was this dude's diagnosis? I have to say, obviously I didn't have the advantage or the benefit of assessing him in person myself, but to me, this screams of psychosis. So psychosis is where you step out of reality and because of a chemical imbalance, you have these very weird experiences, typically hearing voices, auditory hallucinations. I've done a video on that on this channel if you're interested, or delusions, often paranoid delusions, hence the term paranoid schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a tendency to have repeated periods of psychosis. And the reason I think this was psychosis is as follows. Firstly, it's roughly around the kind of age that people first develop a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. So late teens, early 20s, number one. Number two, is very much out of character of this guy, Chanz. So he's not, as I said before, he's not a regularly violent person. He's not antisocial. And he was studying for his A-levels. So for somebody to flip in their behaviour so bizarrely, as opposed to like a thug or a gang member who, might stab somebody for notoriety or to gain money, for somebody to do something so inexplicable, in my view, indicates them stepping out of reality. So they're having experiences that other people cannot fully understand. And probably the most important bit is that comment he made, "You killed the girl." So to me, either he's made that up because he retrospectively wants to get some leniency, or he's suffering a psychotic symptom, because that sounds like a really paranoid thing to say, doesn't it? Saying to a stranger, "You killed that girl," and seemingly attacking them for that reason. That's delusional, I think, unless proven otherwise. So why wasn't he diagnosed with psychosis? Well, there's lots of different potential reasons. One could be that I got it wrong, so he's not psychotic at all, and those statements, etc., there's just some inexplicable reason for them. Number two, the psychiatrist got it wrong, so the court psychiatrist might not have picked up on the subtler forms of psychosis. Or number three, that he was briefly psychotic at the time and his psychosis has cleared since then, which is unusual. And it's very rare, but it does happen. So for example, drug-induced psychosis is an example of somebody becoming completely psychotic very quickly and then going back to their baseline normality. Obviously, that's quite easy to pick up by doing things like urine drug screen tests. By the way, I've done a video on drug-induced psychosis somewhere on this channel if you're interested. Also done a video on, I kid you not, a Wu-Tang Clan affiliated rapper who cut off his own penis in a fit of drug-induced psychosis. Go chiggity, check it out. Okay, so what else are potential diagnoses? Another thing that was ruled out by a psychiatrist during Chanz's trial was a personality disorder. So a personality disorder is different from something like a psychosis because it's ingrained. It's like a character flaw that's there permanently. It's not something that happens to you, it's part of you. So if he was to have a personality disorder, it would probably be, of all the ones that there are, borderline, histrionic, it'd probably be antisocial, otherwise known as dissocial. So people with dissocial personality disorder tend to lack empathy. They can be aggressive, they can be impulsive, they don't care about the difference between right and wrong. Now, the reason I don't think he fits this diagnosis, despite the fact that his action was, obviously incredibly violent, is this. Firstly, because technically you can't get that diagnosis until the age of 18, because your personality hasn't developed until then, and Chanz was 17 at the time. But more importantly, it permeates all aspects of your life. So it's something, it's how you are with all interactions and as a kind of lifestyle. And again, outside of this inexplicable 3-week period, Chanz wasn't antisocial. He didn't have a history of violence or offending. And if you've got an antisocial personality disorder, you use violence and aggression regularly. You're like, some sort of gangster thug wannabe. So I mentioned before that he's got a learning disability. So as you might know, a learning disability is like a reduced IQ. It's a pathological inability to understand complicated information or to function independently. So somebody with a severe learning disability, for example, wouldn't be able to calculate how much money they were spending in a shop, wouldn't be able to read a bus or a tube timetable and travel independently by themselves. They wouldn't be able to do very well academically, would probably struggle to read or write. I don't think Chanz has a significant learning disability. So if he does have one, I think it's mild. And I'll tell you why, because there are clues peppered out throughout this case. So I'm trying to get you to think a bit like a forensic psychiatrist. So number one, he went to a mainstream school, which means that he was just at least clever enough to at least cope with mainstream education. Doesn't necessarily mean he got good grades, but he wasn't deemed to be so cognitively deficient that he needed a special school. Number two, he was found to be fit to plead. So fit to plead means that has the intelligence to actually follow evidence, follow the court case, decide whether to plead guilty or not guilty. And number three, he did not need an intermediary. So an intermediary is where people who have problems understanding the court process, learning disabilities, severe autism, schizophrenia, might need extra help to guide them through the court process. And he was assessed for this, and the court decided he didn't need it. So those things all indicate to me that he did not have a severe learning disability. Okay, so that's my kind of psychoanalytical brain trying to analyse the forensic psychiatry aspects of this case. Let's talk about the emotional impact that it had on me. Well, I think hopefully, like most of you listening to this, it's just kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, the victim was just in his house, and he was literally not answered the door and was dragged out and stabbed almost to death. He's very lucky to be alive, frankly, and that's just a nightmare. And it's so frightening that any of us could potentially be victims, couldn't we? If it's literally somebody coming to your house, it's not you looking for trouble, it's not you being, at the wrong place at the wrong time. It's literally somebody coming to your house. So it's absolutely horrific, and it's really frightening to think that these kind of things happen in this day and age. And I suppose the other element that really kind of got me emotionally was the forgiveness shown by the victim, Dr. 𝐬𝐿. He just shows so much magnanimity, I think. Magnanimity. So, for example, if I'm at a roundabout and somebody coming from the right doesn't indicate that they're going to turn, so they stop me being able to get out, I kind of want that person to die. I mean, not really, but kind of really. I do not have anywhere near the level of empathy and forgiveness that this man has. So I'm impressed, and hats off to him. And obviously, I just wish him all the best. He's a better person than me, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so those are my thoughts on this case. If you're new to this channel, please just let me very briefly describe what it is. My name's Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in psychiatric units. I give expert as a forensic psychiatrist, as an expert witness in criminal trials. So I would be the person that would assess somebody like this to see what their diagnosis was. And why is that important? Why should we care whether Chanz Maximen had a psychiatric diagnosis? What's the point? Basically, to simplify it, it's this. If he did have a psychiatric diagnosis, like a psychosis, if he was hearing voices, for example, that made him compelled to attack this random stranger. And I still think there's a chance that that's actually the case, although that's not what the other psychiatrist found. But if that's what was found by the court, then he might have a psychiatric defence like not guilty by reason of insanity at his disposal. So I've given evidence for this in a number of cases. If you're interested, I've got a video on Andrea Yates' tragic case, nurse who in 2001, she killed 5 of her own children. Absolutely horrific, but she was completely psychotic at the time and she felt compelled to do it because for lots of reasons to do with the devil, hearing voices. I won't go into it now, but if you're interested, definitely check it out. Also a case that I've personally assessed. So one of my most emotional and shocking cases was a young girl called Yasmin. That's not her real name. I change all of the names and demographic details when I talk about my own patients for obvious reasons, but I've called her Yasmin in another video. Go and check that out as well. Those are examples of when somebody has been psychotic and they've done something horrific. Yasmin killed her nephew and there's been a psychiatric defence. Doesn't mean that they're let off. It means that they go to a long-term secure psychiatric unit, which I've worked in before, for long-term rehabilitation. So this video is a bit kind of spontaneous. It's not really, it's only semi-scripted, which is why I keep staring over at my computer. I do deep dive videos and I would urge you, if you're interested in this kind of material, to check one of them out. So it's a lot more scripted, calculated. I go into loads more detail. It's darker, it's deeper, it's sexier, it's funnier. So for example, recently I've done a deep dive on the psychology of stalking, also given a landmark case about that, the psychology of pathological liars. Again, every time I give like a true crime case that's in the news, and also domestic violence, I've done another case on that. Why am I doing all this? Because I want to train you, dear viewers, to start thinking like a forensic psychiatrist. And also to a certain extent, I want to take over the world, but we'll see what happens with that. All that's left to say is I implore you to subscribe to this channel, because if you don't, I promise I will come round to your house when you're sleeping. I will use the toilet, but intentionally in a very messy way. I'm going to leave like wee all over the sides. I'm not going to clean it up. I'm going to leave the toilet lid up. Frankly, if you're not subscribed, you deserve it. As I said before, I'm on Discord. I don't even know what that means yet, but I will in the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested in getting in touch and discussing blah, 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 hit me up on Discord. That's all I have to say, apart from stay euthymic. Buy my book, In Two Minds, released in 10th of March 2022. And do not forget, I love you.